Hello, everyone. Welcome to everyone who's joining us, all participants. And thank you very much to Marco, Justin, and Nev for being willing to participate in this conversation. I will admit to everyone, I'm a little bit nervous myself. This isn't my usual role, so I'll do my best. So the way we're going to do it, we're going to start with hearing from each participant, from Marco first, then Justin, and then Nev for about 10 minutes. I'm not going to say much to introduce anything other than to set the stage for sort of what piece we're talking about, or where each person is coming from, so that the audience has a sense of the jumping in point. These are big issues, big questions, fairly fraught. So I think the hope is that we come to it sort of with our sort of mind and eyes open to see if we can think new things in a sort of context where psychiatry and mental health and mental illness have become sort of a cultural phenomenon of their own. So Marco, welcome. I'm going to start with you. I have sort of sorted through your Boston Review piece, and I'm going to sort of set up and ask you the question at the end, but so people have a sense of where we're coming from. So, as Anthony mentioned, the piece you wrote last year for Boston Review, titled "Mental Illness is Not in Your Head," was the most read new piece. It takes Anne Harrington and Andrew Scull's respective books on psychiatry and offers what I read as something of both a commentary, but also an extension of their critiques on current academic psychiatry. But in the piece, you sketch the history of how different psychiatric paradigms have emerged and held sway in the United States, really since the early asylum period. And you note how these paradigms aren't really able to be disentangled from broader social, political, and economic shifts. While tracing what you identify as a repeating cycle of hype and crisis within psychiatry, which I frame as the excitement and optimism of the newest shiny thing. We're always going for whatever's new. You also draw out the biological and carceral orientations of psychiatry in the United States. You write, and these are from, pretty much verbatim from the article, the real crisis in academic psychiatry, in other words, is that there is no crisis. The future of our profession, if it has one, does not lie in tired promises of biological breakthroughs. It depends on unearthing and embracing neglected histories and genealogies of solidarity with the communities that academic psychiatry claims to serve. And then moving from that, without denying that biology or neurobiology may be implicated in mental distress, or at least that's what I took from it, you call for envisioning a future world where the billions of dollars now invested in biological research are instead redistributed to communities who need it most, and that we imagine care that takes care of the whole human into account, not just brains. And I think that's one of the central themes that we'll hear from others too, is where is the person? What has happened to the subject in all of this? And just to quickly finish up, you mentioned the work when you're reviewing the books, that they sort of set the genealogies for what we're doing now. They set up for the work that communities and professionals are fighting today to abolish the carceral system and to imagine nonviolent forms of care through peer support, soteria houses, and political protest. And the question from all this, that people some idea where you're coming from, is, can you talk more about what this different political imaginary might look like, and why it's so difficult to break this biological, hyper-individualistic mental health narrative that, quite frankly, I think exceeds the clinic and has become something of a well-loved cultural phenomenon that we hold on to even as we try to break it. And I was wondering if you could sort of take up any of that.
Yeah, thank you. Those are huge questions. So I'll try to gesture towards some of my thinking along those lines here. And I hope that as we continue to discuss, some of those themes will get pulled out into our broader discussion. But before diving in, I wanted to thank Anthony for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here with both Justin and Nev, whose work I respect immensely. Thank you to the Philosophers for sort of hosting this, and also to Kendall for being what I'm very confident you're going to be an excellent discussant. So thank you. If it's only based on the summary of my article, I think you're going to be great. So I'll start actually talking some about the sort of, in some ways, and I'm going to try to keep my comments to around 10 minutes, the stranglehold in many ways that the biological model or the biomedical paradigm has on the thinking of mental illness, particularly in academic medical centers and in research, and then move from that to sort of talking more about some of these other approaches that might offer different ways of thinking about it. And really, I think in a lot of ways, at least in the academy, part of what we're lacking right now, especially in psychiatric departments, is a broader imagination of what mental illness is. And so I'm going to sort of sketch out some lines of what I think different ways I think we could think. Right now, and really since at least the 80s, we've had this sort of model that we're going to try to shove mental illness into a biomedical paradigm, right? And we're going to try to treat it like chronic diseases like diabetes. And the argument goes is that if we can put mental illness into this biomedical box, then it's going to reduce the stigma that's been associated with mental illness for centuries, right? And it's going to destigmatize it. This idea is problematic for a whole host of reasons. For one, medical diagnoses continue to have stigma associated with them. And two, biologizing a particular condition can also cause it to be sort of seen as essential to a person and can also relate to stigma. But what I want to suggest is a different way of looking at mental illness. I've increasingly started to see mental illness not pushing back against this biomedical paradigm, not as some underlying disease that we're going to uncover with ever more accurate technologies, but really seeing mental illness as a product of processes that are happening in the world. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it's a product of processes that can be clinical, that can be scientific, and that can be cultural. And these processes essentially transform someone's individual experience of psychic and emotional distress into a diagnostic label. So in the clinic, this can look like a physician talking to a patient in a diagnostic interview. The patient comes in with a particular lived experience of distress that they're suffering. And by the end of it, the physician's coding a particular diagnostic category in their book. It can look like a scientific research study where someone's filling out a survey and sort of translating or trying to translate or constrain their experience into this, Hamilton D depression scale or something like that. But it can also, as you were suggesting, Kendall, be cultural. It can be talking to a loved one who also has been diagnosed with depression, and that loved one saying, you know what you're experiencing sounds like depression to me. It can be a direct-to-consumer advertisement on TV where you have a pharmaceutical company that's trying to get you to associate your distress with a particular diagnosis so that you'll go to your doctor and ask for a particular pharmaceutical and so that they can make a profit. So all of these processes have sort of developed within our society in different spaces that literally sort of construct mental illness as something that we reach for when we're feeling distressed. And there's 2 points that I kind of want to make along those lines. The first is that these processes are implicated in power, right? They're unequal, right? All of these processes have various relationships with privilege and power and oppression. And this is reflected and this is something I cite in the article, the fact that, for example, if you're a person of color who sees a psychiatrist in this country, you're more likely to get a diagnosis for a psychotic disorder than a white person, right? And the fact that that process results in that particular diagnosis is a product of history and the historical ties between sort of pathologizing Black activism in the United States. Or if you're a white person in this country and you go to psychiatric hospital, you're more likely to get a mood disorder, you're more likely to get an antidepressant and not an antipsychotic. Women in this country tend to get diagnoses of borderline personality disorder. So that's all to say that all of these processes that can be scientific, clinical, cultural, popular, are inflected with power in various ways. And we can't understand mental illness without having that power within the frame. I see the chat. Immigrants are also diagnosed at higher rates. And there's some somewhat sketchy research that links immigration to schizophrenia that we could unpack as well. And all of this is inflected with power, and we can talk more about what those power dynamics look like in a particular setting. And the second point is that they're also products of history, these processes. That means that they've changed over time, and they will necessarily change over time. They are not static processes. The way that someone's individual distress becomes a mental illness was different 100 years ago, was different 20 years ago than it is today, and it will be different in the future. And I think it's important to say that because we can feel so constrained. I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for others. I've felt so constrained, both as someone who uses mental health services and as a practitioner, by the current system that has the most privilege in our society, biomedical psychiatry. But things will change, and things are changing underneath our feet. And this question about how these processes are linked to history opens up another question, which in many ways to me is the most important one, is what should these processes look like? If they are mutable, if they are changeable, if they will necessarily change, how should they change? How should we enable these processes of sort of a person's individual experience becoming a mental illness in our society? And this question is related in a lot of ways, and this will get to the sort of point you were mentioning before about community, more community-led and community-engaged ways to approach mental health. I think one question looking at the history of mental health that emerges loud and clear is who gets to control these processes by which someone's psychic distress becomes labeled as a mental illness. And historically, right, and in many ways today, it's people with lived experience of these processes who are actually the ones who end up with a diagnosis, are left out of the discussion about how someone ends up with a diagnosis in the first place. They're left out of these processes, whether they're clinical, whether they're scientific, whether they have to do with pharmaceutical companies. They're excluded. And of course, that's no accident, right? Mental illness historically as a diagnosis has been one in which it takes away someone's agency, right? It takes away someone's ability to think independently or think critically. And so if you really feel mental illness is that, then of course they're not offered, people who have lived experience of mental illnesses aren't offered a seat at the table when the discussion of how to approach these matters is considered. So that's all of these approaches, whether it's soteria houses, whether it's more community-led sort of abolitionist efforts to stop psychiatric jails, all of these processes, I think today, from what I've seen in my own work, center that question of who's involved, who has a voice. And the last thing I'll say, and this is a plug a bit for me as a historian that I can't resist, is that a lot of our histories, including the histories outlined in the two books I reviewed, are histories of psychiatric oppression. And I think we definitely need those. I think we need to understand the ways that these diagnoses have been used to harm the people who they're supposed to be caring for, they're supposed to be helping. But I think we also do ourselves a disservice if we don't use history to find more and to discover more liberatory forms of mental health. And in my own particular research in Latin America, where I look at liberation psychiatry, I've become very interested in how practitioners in the 1970s in Latin America, many of whom were fighting against violent military dictatorships and trying to take care of their communities who were facing trauma from often US state-sponsored violence in the region, how they tied a notion of mental health to political liberation. And specifically, they said that you can only be mentally healthy if you are liberated from the structures of oppression in your society that psychologically harm you. Right? And that's such a simple idea, but it's so not central to the way that psychiatrists and mental health professionals are taught today. And so I think history can also be a resource, and this is in that quote you mentioned what I'm trying to say, for pulling up or lifting up these sort of neglected genealogies of the history of psychiatry or the history of mental health from the sort of dustbin of history that biomedical psychiatry has relegated these histories to, and that unearthing these histories can really expand our imagination in profound ways. And I know I didn't answer all your questions, but I am at 10 minutes, and I want to hear what others have to say. So I'll stop there if that's okay.
Thank you, Marco. That was actually very rich and pretty much hit everything in some way. There's quite a bit you say though that I think transitions us nicely to Justin. I'm particularly struck, Marco and Justin, I think when you talk about sort of your ideas, this will maybe overlap a little bit of people with the experience are very often excluded. And I'm, this notion of elite capture, that those of us who get a seat at the table. So Olufemi Otaiwo, who is at Georgetown, who's been on this, when his book, he wrote an essay, but also his book on elite capture, like who's in the room, really, we have to ask who isn't in the room. But to your point about agency and all this, is I've, my own experience has always been, as long as I'm, as long as you can pass, in other words, as long as you're not yourself to some extent, you're welcome at the table. But when you come in the fullness of who you are and your experience, you're actually not welcome. And if you're able to come to the table, you're not representing everybody, and that voice often gets left out. So I always want to put a nod to who isn't able, for whatever reason, structural or whatever, to join. And so moving a little bit away from some of the more structural stuff and the power and process stuff, Justin, I want to move to you on, if I can find where I wrote it. So your article for Eon, which I very much appreciated, titled "The Helpful Delusion," and you start talking about your experience with your father and his experience of sort of some of his delusional world, as we tend to think of it. But in the article, you ask us to rethink, or how I read it was, you're asking us to rethink what it is we're doing, saying, and bringing into being when we talk about mental illness as a thing, when we speak about mental illness as an entity or a disease, sort of along the lines of what Marco was suggesting. And if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting we might be better served by thinking about this thing we call mental illness in terms of process and adaptation rather than dysfunction. And specifically, you make the case for what you call madness as strategy, and sort of juxtapose it to our current view of madness as dysfunction. And really simply, can you say more about what you mean by madness as strategy, and locate it in the context of what's currently, as we just heard, sort of a dominating and domineering approach to madness, mental illness as brain disease, and with it always keeping at the center the accompanying diminishment of the actual person who's experiencing it. So with that.
Thank you for that question. It's a really great question. Also, I just want to thank Anthony for putting this together and to, inviting me to be here. So yeah, the basic idea that I've been pursuing for the last couple of years in my work is really, what does it mean to see mental disorders as functional rather than dysfunctional? Or if you wanted to put that in a colorful slogan, as I like to, what does it mean to see mental illness in terms of purpose rather than pathology, or design rather than disease? And so the real goal of my work has been to kind of re-inject this standpoint of purpose, function, design into thinking about mental illness. And that's a standpoint that I call madness as strategy. And I contrast it with one I call madness as dysfunction. And in some ways, I think it can be very illuminating to read the whole history of psychiatry as something like a clash or a confrontation between these two points of view. I mean, there are a lot of ways of reading the history of psychiatry, but that's just one particularly interesting way to me. And there are historical precedents for madness as strategy. It goes back a long time, but I do agree with Marco that this point of view is largely displaced in the 1970s by this kind of emerging or re-emerging biomedical perspective. And it's almost impossible, or it is impossible, to spell out all the reasons for why that perspective really gripped us. And Marco has spelled some of those out in the Boston Review piece. I'm working on a book now about that particular era, but the basic idea behind what I'm calling madness as dysfunction is this idea that when somebody has a mental illness, it's because something inside of you, in your mind or in your brain, just isn't working the way that it's supposed to. Something's not working right. It's not working as nature intended. And so one of the things that I've been doing largely in this blog for Psychology Today is exploring specific research programs that put function, purpose, adaptation back at the center of psychiatry. And I'll give you two just quick examples of what that looks like. My favorite example of this is depression, and it speaks to me because I was hospitalized for a time for depression. But you have these evolutionary theorists like Randolph Ness or Vivek Glover, and one of their ideas is that depression, far from being a chemical imbalance, is actually part of your brain's evolved signal. It's effectively your brain's wake-up call that something in your life is not going the way that it should and should be addressed, particularly with respect to the social sphere. So it could be a relationship, it could be a career goal, it could be a life plan. The basic vision is that depression is your brain trying to tell you to tell you something. And in that respect, depression is kind of like, they see depression as kind of like nausea. Nobody likes to feel nauseous, but we all recognize it as part of your body's basic, functionality, and that it's effectively your body's way of telling you to stay away from a certain food, or the way that we see a fever. Again, we used to think of fever as kind of a medical disorder. Now we tend to think of it as your body's healing mechanism, though of course one that can go wrong in its own ways. Now here's the incredible thing about this picture. Suppose that that's right. Suppose that depression is, or some forms of depression, sometimes depression is something like your brain's wake-up call. What that means is that biomedical psychiatry for the last 50 years has in some respects gotten everything exactly wrong, because we treat it like a disease or disorder. We tend to pummel it with antidepressants rather than, okay, what is it trying to say? And let me just be very clear. I think there's always a role for medication. I think medication does have an essential role in psychiatry, but perhaps not as central a role as Manis's dysfunction tends to think. And I'll give you one other example, which is delusions. And I should say that Nev has written quite extensively on this on this topic, and it's the very concept of a delusion is as I'm coming to see far more complex, more nuanced, more problematic than I've often thought of it as. It not just because of the traditional philosopher's dilemma, where exactly does delusion end and run-of-the-mill conspiracy theory begin, but also in some cases it's not really clear where the line is between delusion and hallucination. So it's a very complex topic, and I'm not pretending that it's less complex than it is. But one standpoint that's really been, well, not emerging, but re-emerging perhaps over the last couple of years, is this idea that some delusions may actually have a protective role in helping us deal with a life problem. Some delusions may actually give us a much needed sense of purpose, significance, or meaning in life. And again, this is an old idea. It goes back at least 200 years. It's definitely a part of a Hollywood trope that your delusions are playing some kind of important role. But I think it's one of these insights that was largely displaced by this medical paradigm. But if it's right, it absolutely transforms the way that you think about delusions, because again, instead of, okay, this is a symptom of a disorder, we've got to pummel it with antipsychotic medications. The issue may be, okay, what might this delusion be doing for this person, and how can we come up with other strategies to deal with whatever that they're using the delusion to deal with. But let me just wrap up with what you said about kind of bringing the person to the center of the conversation, because the question isn't and can't be, okay, how do these ideas about function and dysfunction make me a better researcher or a better clinician or a better philosopher? But really, how do they impact people who have been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses. And one thing I'm quite interested in, Marco mentioned, is the issue of stigma. You know, in the 1970s, 1980s, this madness as dysfunction point of view partly sold itself on the idea that we're your allies in the fight against stigma. The sooner people figure out that depression is kind of like diabetes or schizophrenia is kind of like cancer, the sooner they're going to stop stigmatizing these conditions. But of course, what we've found out is that the biomedical perspective really carries a distinctive kind of stigma along with it. Okay, I'm not a bad person for having depression. I'm not a bad person for having delusions, but there may be something terribly wrong with my brain. I might be unpredictable. It's questionable whether I'm ever going to get better. And these are well documented. And really, everything I'm saying is very well documented. If you're interested in looking at some of these claims about delusions or depression, I would definitely encourage you to check out that. I'm talking to everybody now. But I would encourage you to check out this Psychology Today blog, where I really try to document these ideas. But in contrast to the madness as dysfunction model, there's some very preliminary evidence that when we view depression not as a chemical imbalance, but as kind of your brain's designed signal that something in your life isn't going well, that tends to have a powerful and a good impact on how we feel about ourselves, people with depression, in three specific ways. It tends to make people more optimistic about recovery. It tends to give people a greater sense of control and of agency over treatment. And it tends to give people the sense that their depression has some kind of special insight to offer them. So in my mind, there's just a profound ethical imperative for us to really think seriously about how we frame the issue in terms of function and dysfunction. For the love of God, please don't say, some people sometimes do, well, I don't really use these notions of function and dysfunction in my work, because everybody really does. I think that their function and dysfunction are just inescapable features of human cognition. So to me, the question is really, how can I become more aware of these framings, and how can I deploy these framings in a more, useful and in a more strategic way? So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate that. There's much you say. I think I actually don't know that it may be well documented, but I think in the general public, there's not awareness of sort of the conversations that people are having who are more critical of the current model. And there is this sort of embrace of the biomedical sort of truth, almost as dogma. And one of the interesting places you see it is, or I saw it, and this is anecdotal, was during the pandemic early on, when vaccines first came out, and there was sort of, in some camps, there was a sort of anger against people who were vaccine hesitant. And the claim sometimes, when it was stayed within a certain framework, was they don't understand the science. People don't understand the science. But when you present that same group criticizing vaccine hesitant people with the repeated sort of inability to replicate any sort of the serotonin sort of hypothesis of depression, that particular part of chemical imbalance specific to serotonin, that it's sort of, it's not a thing. There's a very quick, but it is for me. Like there's the sort of but I do understand this science, even though that there's something about psychiatry and mental health that gets to the core of who we are. It is one of our explanatory frameworks for meaning and for making sense of the world now. And so I think there's actually, the more voices out there complicating the picture, the better. So and thank you. I appreciate you for your time today. All right, Nev, your turn. So Nev and I know each other probably better than I know the others, but for this, I think that from what I know of your work and what I understand of it, you sort of bridge in really interesting and difficult ways what Marco's sort of talking about and what Justin are talking about without you all overlap, but there is a complication when sort of the clinical in a way and the structural or the social come together sometimes. So but from my sense, your work it's a nice bridge between sort of a well-established and well-financed, critical kind of a well-financed psychiatric paradigm that simultaneously, and I think this is challenging, it's simultaneously individual, it's biological, that's an individual thing, and it's also socio-political, it's carceral, it's control, it's behavioral. Behavioral health is not a neutral, and it's not a benign name for joining mental health and substance use. There's actually something much bigger going on with behavioral health. But so there's sort of this reductive individual side of current psychiatric discourse and around mental health, and there's also the social political side, also economic. So and Justin's account also draws to the personal, but there's a tendency sort of to move psychiatric practice kind of moves. It seeks normalcy, whoever gets to define that, through pathology, and then a return to normalcy often. And again, the person sort of gets packaged away as not relevant. You show up in the clinical encounter and sometimes in the social system encounter as a what? You're a name, you're a label, you're not a who. And both of these things mingle or with your work. So one thread of your work reclaims the meaning aspects of madness, specifically of psychosis, which I think isn't that well understood and is sometimes misunderstood as simply hearing voices, as if that's the totality of the experience of psychosis. And a second thread asks questions about, and I think this is hugely important, about structural accountability in the face of social abandonment of individuals experiencing complex long-term disability. And the real challenge is at the intersection of those threads. So something that is very fraught and is hard often to talk about is back to sort of Justin, your ethical notion is the ethical question about what do we do in a system that has sort of carceral care or nothing. And we're not great, even though there's a vast public mental health system in some areas of the country, New York City being one of them. It's sort of an all or nothing. And again, people get lost, it's racialized, it's quite brutal at times. And so if you can just talk about some of that knottedness and how you understand it and think about it.
Thanks, Kendall. And again, thank you to Anthony and you, Kendall, for all the legwork you've done organizing, and Marco and Justin going third. I'm sort of still, kind of processing and thinking through things that Marco and Justin were saying as well as this question. I think one place I would just start, which is kind of maybe more of a meta reflection on the dialogue so far, is to just say, I think we have these sort of umbrella constructs, which in some contexts function as kind of master constructs: mental illness, mental health. And what falls under them is in fact hugely heterogeneous. And in every possible sense, in terms of what people are experiencing, in terms of epidemiology and etiology, social consequences, levels of stigma and discrimination, levels of kind of social societal abandonment, levels of disability. So just starting there in terms of my work, which is sort of, immersive in the sense of being a participatory and qualitative or mixed methods mental health services researcher, but also, activist in this space, is sort of being immersed in different kind of community settings and contexts in which folks are receiving services. So one thing I would say is I did a project in Florida where I was really looking at young people and youth who were encountering the system often for the first time through carceral intervention, through involuntary commitment, and often in cases in which they were experiencing just very understandable distress in response to things like sexual assault or rape, or, acute stressors, and then sort of kind of the responses through a very kind of particular lens and particular type of setting. And that, when I kind of think about unpacking those issues, is really, really different from the work that I have done focused on, what gets labeled as schizophrenia in the public mental health system, and what people are experiencing and what happens to them, especially kind of folks with long-term kind of complex experiences of psychosis and associated disability, who end up sort of entrapped and entangled in multiple systems, homelessness services, the criminal legal system or juvenile legal system, as well as kind of public sector mental health, subsidized housing, et cetera, SSI, SSDI. I think that we often do a real kind of disservice to the range of people's experiences by collapsing so much under these sort of umbrellas. And, even the term lived experience, like lived experience sort of what, under what circumstances, in what context, and people inadvertently or unintentionally, I think, even end up speaking for, being perceived to speak for, or being framed as speaking for maybe a much broader range of kind of experiences and intersections than they're necessarily kind of bringing to the table. So that's just kind of a long way of giving a little bit of context, I guess, around where I start. And I think when we turn to psychosis / schizophrenia, that there's sort of two threads that I work with that I think are in tension with each other to some extent. One is that we really do need to kind of, I think, reclaim the role of meaning making and the meaning ladenness of these experiences in terms of any healing process, but also just in terms of social dialogue and engagement, right? So far too often, there is a kind of medical reductionism, and I wouldn't say sort of medical model, because the medical model, again, is huge and expansive and heterogeneous, but there is a potential medical reductionism at play when what it is, the content of what people are experiencing, is not deeply engaged with, in which we don't enter into a dialogue, and a dialogue that would make sort of healing processes possible. And then on the other hand, from a more what I guess I would call a structural perspective, there is a reality of disability and a reality of what in the sort of disability studies world would be referred to as impairment, and a tremendous, deep kind of societal marginalization of folks with really kind of significant long-term complex disabilities. So when one thinks about the person on the subway car or the bus who is unhoused and who appears to just a kid, a member of the general public, whoever is on that car or that bus, as disheveled, as not taking care of themselves, as maybe muttering incoherently. I think these are common ways in which people kind of observe a certain kind of very marginalized group in society. And that, kind of when we think about the amount of both sort of unmet needs and structural investment that is necessary, that actually sort of downplaying or risking downplaying disability or even impairment becomes potentially catastrophic in terms of a failure then, or providing an alibi to, withholding or failing to provide significant kind of services. And there, I think kind of the cross-disability lens is in some ways the most helpful. So when we look at, serious spinal cord injuries, mobility impairment, there's no debate about, is it real, is it not real? There is a provision of services which are kind of deeply needed. So I think one of the challenges when kind of critiquing, when asking the question, what is mental illness, and when kind of critiquing versions of the way that term might be understood, is this in me this kind of desire to also really kind of preserve, and not just preserve the current level, but really we need much deeper and more expansive investment in supporting folks and in supporting kind of community integration and participation. So maybe I'll kind of stop there, because I assume this will start to turn into kind of more of a dialogue, but I think there is this concern that to a lot of society, significant disabilities in general, not just in the psychiatric space, but in general, are not a societal priority, and that there is sort of disinvestment across the board. This is, some legal scholars have analyzed kind of failures in the implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act in this way, right? That there just is not a level of at which these issues are kind of broadly seen as relevant, as gripping, as sort of moving people to action or to change. So I worry about how we navigate this space in terms of preserving really kind of a need for significant investment, and also sort of reclaiming or reframing experiences in ways that kind of fully fully place them in a field of meaning.
That it? All right, thank you, Nev. My brain is exploding a little bit as I try to think about how to bring these three together, but Nev, you sort of, all three of you in different ways help with this. And Marco, this may come a little bit from your piece in language, but it's sort of addressed all three of you. I'm not quite sure how we manage that this way, but what strikes me really that sort of holds in different ways these three sort of perspectives together, and correct me if this doesn't seem right, is sort of a fundamental failure of imagination within psychiatry. Like within psychiatry, but also how we want to live together. All of a sudden it blows up, and this is sort of the challenge of I actually don't think trying to define mental illness the way we've been doing it. And Marco, I need to think about how you just the whole set of processes, because that seems much more that seems much more manageable, and sort of people's responses to situations and meaning and purpose, like they seem better ways. But as soon as we start trying to pin things down, they squirt out from under us. It's very hard to handle. And so the question I always ask, and I suppose this is a question I'm asking, is for me the heart of most of my work is, how do we better live well together? It's an ethical question. It's a political ethical question. What kind of world do we imagine, and why has psychiatry for so long, certainly in the United States, and I don't know enough outside and I know that there will be people from outside the US, so those of you have more knowledge than I do cross-culturally. Why is it always so attached to control? And is that just how it is? And if so, control to what end? Because global mental health and this phenomenon, quite frankly, to me, baffles me. I'm probably one of the few who thinks this, because the concept of global to my mind, is globalization. It's tied to market and polity. And it is not it's not international, it's global. And if we want to reshape psychiatry and how people are received in our communities, which seems to me important, it baffles me that we continue to take up language that has an entirely different meaning to it. And so any responses to sort of that notion of imagination and what the world looks like. I don't know how to pick.
Yeah, to start with, I'd love to jump in, and the Justin and Nev's comments were really incredible. And I want to actually combine sort of your question about how do we live together well, and what role does that have to play in a discussion like this that is framed by this question, what is mental illness, which seems in some ways, like you're saying, I sympathize with it being the wrong question. But I want to also build on what Nev was saying at the end about this sort of critical discussion, unpacking what this term mental health or mental illness means in all its heterogeneity, while also keeping next to that the fact that people need resources that they're not getting, and people need help and assistance materially that they're just not getting. And this is more pointing out something I've noticed in the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, that alongside that reality of people who are labeled by a system as having mental illness and are not getting the resources they need to live the lives that they want to live, and in many cases, their psychological distress coming from a larger system, right, that's marginalizing them. Alongside that, mental health has become the answer to so many questions that it is not suited to answer. So, for example, in the wake of mass shootings in the United States, both the political left and the political right come together and say, we need access to mental health services. It's one of the few things in this sort of politically polarized setting that it seems like these two sides can agree on, is that we need more access to mental health services. I've seen the same thing in the wake of tragic suicides at Yale University and in our campus. Everyone says we need more access to mental health services. And so what I would say, and there's many, many examples like this, where we have this larger issue of violence that's ripping apart communities, right? Whether directed at yourself or at others. And this mental health label gets slapped on as the solution. And the first thing I guess I would say along these lines is that mental health, as it's conceived in these conversations, I actually think is getting in the way of people living together well, right? So in the case, it's a means for taking larger structural problems that have to do with our culture and that are intractable and deep-seated. And instead of confronting those issues head on, putting the label of mental health on it allows you to individualize the problem. This person was sick. It's not our society that's sick, it's this person. And if they had seen a psychiatrist, which there's no evidence, by the way, that psychiatrists have the magical power to stop people from committing violence. There's literally no data or evidence that that's the case. The idea is that this individual would somehow get, this tragedy would not have occurred. And it's the same here at Yale. This is a hyper-competitive setting that drives many of the students and faculty into this sort of zero-sum game where they're pitted against each other, and it can lead to a lot of psychic distress, even though there's an immense amount of privilege here. And instead of reflecting, how is this culture pathogenic, right? How is this culture harming people in a structural sense? Labeling it with mental health sort of allows you to say, okay, we'll spend some money on getting some psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. We'll bring them in. Problems done. That's the extent of our intervention, and everyone can agree that's good. And the last thing I'll say is that as a mental health professional myself, I've also seen it on the other side. In the wake of these debates, I think a lot of mental health professionals know that their profession as it's currently conceived cannot help with these questions. But at the same time, they don't have the resources they need to help the people they see in front of them. And so they're willing to accept these resources, but it creates this loop, right? With mental health is the solution to these intractable problems. The professionals are understaffed and under-resourced and say, okay, give us the resources if this is the justification. And you just have this self-perpetuating system where nothing is actually connecting with the larger structural factors that are promoting people's distress.
Thank you. Nev, I see your hand. And so we'll give each Nev and Justin a chance, and then I think we need to move to audience questions, chat questions. So Nev, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, just a quick response is what I worry about is that it's really not an either or, but it's really difficult to remain in the space of something that's not an either or. And I think that's why, when I think about, again, kind of long-term psychosis involving significant disability, it would be reductionistic of a psychosocial form to see that purely as a response to, or even primarily a response to, underlying social and structural determinants. And I think that people are extraordinarily, so I did a webinar co-organized a webinar not that long ago on exclusionary sanism. And so I think as a society, we actually have an incredibly deep inability to really engage and accommodate folks labeled as an actively manifesting what we would describe as psychosis or psychotic or delusional thinking or disorganized thinking. And I don't want that to be lost, because I think that there is an extreme inability in our society actually right now to really engage with, include folks experiencing these things. And whether we want to say that is a reflection of what's happening in their brains or not is in some sense immaterial to me. There is a reality of experiences of disability that is mental, psychiatric, and it's not just that they need housing. It's not just that they need material resources. And deeper forms of societal inclusion demand that we not just fall on the side of we need to address social and structural determinants or forms of inequity, but also that we have to ask ourselves really deep and hard questions about what it is that we can or can't in sort of kind of everyday discourse engage with. And I think if one has spent much time with people experiencing what is labeled as psychosis or schizophrenia in public places, it is everyone. This is not psychiatrists. This is not psychiatry. This is a problem of everyday people, store clerks, case managers in SSI offices, et cetera, who really do not know how to engage with that and that thing, whatever exactly its ideological origins, which we can debate, or status, is something we really, really need to attend to. And here, I think kind of Marco, just to reflect, is maybe different from a young person who's been raped and is distressed. And that they're not the same thing. They're not really in the same category, even though we put them in the same category. And I think, again, that just sort of something I see dropping out of these kinds of debates or dialogues or discussions sometimes that is really important and plays out specifically in certain kinds of encounters, like decisions around involuntary commitment, assisted outpatient treatment, et cetera, where the question is not as easy as give the person housing, food, and where the demand on us, the ethical and moral and socio-political demands, push us to a much deeper place, and maybe a place that is in some sense sort of impossible. Impossible decisions are involved. And there's an element of tragedy to it, right? Of sort of the impossibility of really kind of knowing and proceeding in a way that one can ever feel confident is entirely ethical. So I just think those issues are not always there. They're not there across the whole spectrum, and it's something to really engage with.
Absolutely. And just as a very small point, I think I agree with much of that. And I guess I was sort of trying to lay out the sort of ideological deployment of mental health, right? And so it's striking that the realities that you're describing for people who are labeled as having these conditions and are not getting the kind of the support that they desperately need are sort of marginalized in our public discussion, while these larger these issues about mass shootings, et cetera, get lots of attention, and mental health is slapped to it in this particular way. So, yeah.
Thanks. Justin, I want to give you a chance before we move to questions.
Be really, really brief, but there's so much, and as you said, Kendall, my brain is exploding too, but in the best possible way. And what Nev just said is really, the impossibility, the impossibility of moving forward in a way that you can feel totally confident that you're doing, exactly the right thing. But very quickly, I want to address one theme that's come up that we keep circling around, which is how to integrate these kind of individualistic, psychological, even biological perspectives with social, cultural, systemic perspectives. And that seems to be such a pivotal problem that we're all dealing with in different ways. And just, I guess, to make a pitch for my own somewhat idiosyncratic set of interest, I do think that the notion of function and dysfunction can play a valuable role here. It seems to me when we think in terms of okay, you have a brain dysfunction that tends to move us, or even if you have a psychological dysfunction that tends to move us in this kind of individualistic way where we look closer and closer at your past and at your brain and at your genetics. And we don't ignore the environment, but we tend to reduce the environment to the role of a triggering cause. So you have all this internal predispositions, and then the environment just becomes this kind of tangential thing. Whereas it seems to me that if you start thinking, like with depression, if you start thinking of depression, okay, what if this is something like a designed signal that something in my life isn't working out? Immediately you're thrown back into the world, because the question then becomes, okay, what exactly is going on that this is a response to? You still have the brain-based and the genetics and the individual history, but you're thrown right back out into what are the larger environmental, social, cultural pressures to which my depression is a response. So that's just a pitch for thinking of function and dysfunction in that respect.
Thank you, Justin. We're actually gonna stay with that as I watch time, because there are two questions that are similar that are specifically for you around Justin. I mean, around function. So the first one is says Justin started by mentioning the medical idea that mental illness is where the brain isn't working as nature intended. Where can we find out more about how we got to the conclusion that a particular brain state is as nature intended? How do we know what nature intends for us? And the person apologizes because they joined a little late if you've already covered it. But I want to combine it with the next question just because they're similar. And it's great talk, really loved it. Do you think that if we think about mental illness as function, and some people don't see any function or meaning behind what they've experienced, would that foster a new type of stigma? Something the person is worried about on their own work in post-traumatic growth following psychosis. So where does function come from, and what if it doesn't mean anything?
Yeah, if I could just respond to that right again quickly, as I see it, the notions of design, what nature intended, is so woven into medical thinking that we can criticize them all we want, or we can say that it's some kind of anthropomorphic projection, but I just think it's woven into the way humans see things, and it's woven into medicine. We're either, like it or not, we're either seeing something like fever as functional, as part of nature's healing method, or as somewhat neutral, or as dysfunction, as failing in what nature intended. And I think it's really hard to say much more, because not only is it so deeply ingrained in cognition, but I think different thinkers at different eras, and this is one thing I was trying to do in my book, is that different thinkers in different eras have construed the notion of purpose in such radically different ways. 1,000 years ago, purpose was always, well, it was God's purpose for humanity. And 200 years ago, purpose was the idea of the body having some kind of innate healing power or innate wisdom. And today we tend to think of purpose more in kind of Darwinian and evolutionary terms. So it's, I have my own thoughts and ideas about how to think well about function and purpose, but the larger goal of my work is just to bring those notions to the fore and to acknowledge that they are problematic, and people will think about them in very different ways.
Great, thank you. Nev, the next one is for you. Says it's could you comment on the tension of privileging knowledge from individual experience versus knowledge from mental sciences drawn from generalizations empirically grounded? Loved your talk, by the way. So says the commenter. So
yeah, okay, so that's sort of a little bit of a different thread to pick up here. Again, I don't think that they're necessarily that far apart, in that, for instance, qualitative research is really just really kind of engaging with lived experience, but variations and heterogeneous patterns within that, and identifying commonalities as well as, you know, areas in which there's difference. And on some level, even quantitative work is often grounded in individual data collected. So I don't think that they're necessarily in tension. Who is in a decision-making role, who is interpreting and analyzing the data, makes a huge difference and is going to, on some level, right, reflect people's own grounded positionalities. So I think it is really important to diversify who it is through what lenses, plural, is also in that position of deciding what questions are going to be asked, how qualitative or quantitative data is going to be coded or analyzed, writing up the meaning of that. And it's a kind of across the board, I would say, that underrepresented positionalities, that's a problem, and it's a problem, you know, at a large scale. So when we do not have folks in academia in research positions who have experienced poverty, incarceration, public sector mental health services, as well as direct lived experience of things like disabilities. And again, sort of to kind of just flip that, right? It's more a problem in my mind of kind of a homogenization of what we see as sort of dominant discourse in the mental health kind of is by people with overly homogeneous maybe perspectives and experiences that risk sort of crowding out more minoritized viewpoints that start to creep in. So I don't really see them as in tension. I think we kind of have to think about epistemic diversity kind of across the board, and likewise first person perspectives, if they're deployed in a way that is not attuned to difference, they can also be problematic. We can probably find on any given issue, we can find somebody whose lived experience leads them to arrive at any point possible on a spectrum from, you know, let's say, just to take an easy example like involuntary commitment, who has found it profoundly beneficial to profoundly destructive and everything in between. So I do think there's something really important about engaging with a diversity of perspectives that is not always there. Now, I think a lot of lived experience leaders are not just speaking from their own maybe kind of individual experience, but they have been involved in a variety of ways. And so immersed in really kind of, in a sense, what an anthropologist or qualitative researcher might be doing, just less formally. So they're seeing other people, they're seeing patterns, and they're developing a deeper insights into maybe what needs to change, what the problems are based on that.
Thanks, Nev. There are quite a few questions about resources, Marco, for liberatory stuff in South America. I know you've done some work around Argentina and stuff, but maybe we can get those, Anthony, somehow to people in a separate, because there's another question that I think actually is really important and comes up often, and I think it deserves a response and sort of a little bit of in the time we have left. And it's a familiar question, but I think it's important to hear and take seriously. It says, I would love to hear the answer to this question from the chat. Do any of the panelists have an affinity with Thomas Ozz's work? I would add, obviously, R.D. Laing too. And I think it's important to hear that question and take it seriously, because it's out there and it's important. So for each of you, as you want, let's wrap up, I guess, with that, because we have 3 minutes left. Anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
Justin.
Okay, I'm happy to say something. Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of Saz's work. Thomas Saz, The Myth of Mental Illness, that's who we're talking about, right? I mean, I read the classic, work, and I think that, I mean, it's incredibly problematic in some ways. He had some very limited in viewpoints, and he gets into kind of sometimes patient blaming in a way that's like really kind of shocking. But I think it's I think he was absolutely trying to deal with some of these exact same kinds of problems that we're dealing with today, which is, what is that once we see mental illness as a medical phenomenon, what has to happen for us to see mental illness as a medical phenomenon, and how does that affect our understanding of human distress? Lang was onto the same thing. So despite his failures, and despite some of the ways that he really went wrong in his thinking, in ways that are, I think, quite stigmatizing in their own way, I think he was earnestly grappling with this core question: what happens when distress becomes medicalized? How does that work, and what are its effects? And in that way, I think we can still learn from some of his work.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Justin. Marco, did you have a
Yeah. Yeah, it is an important question to address. And I sympathize with, in many ways, or go along with Justin's response, that there was, we could have a whole talk about Saz's problematic nature. And I think, I mean, just to build on some of what Justin said, is the real paternalism that he demonstrated, particularly with respect to people who did identify with their psychic distress as a mental illness, right? That can be a liberatory experience for people who start to reflect on, oh, this thing I didn't understand is this other thing. And that can be a powerful experience to people that we shouldn't, in some sort of cynical, ironic, like we know more than you sort of way, just dismiss. And that's the issue. That's one among several issues that I have with Saz. But I think the thing, and this is just building on what Justin said, is the problematic that he was trying to get at, right? Which is essentially what is implied when someone's psychic experience is labeled as mental illness. What does that mean for the person? What does that mean for the professional? What does that mean for society more generally? That sort of, in some ways, dogged interrogation of that, and being in some ways, in his own way, very creative and sometimes, for better or worse, iconoclastic with how he approached that question, I think is that sort of spirit in many ways is something that I think is lacking, particularly in the spaces in which he circulated, which are academic ones. And one, if people want to read more, this book by Leah Ben Moshe, which is Decarcerating Disability, where they really look at, they have a chapter on Saz and sort of really tease through what is useful about his spirit of critical inquiry that can still serve efforts today to fight for people with disabilities. And I think that's a really good read if people are interested. Yeah.
Nev, do you have anything you want to?
We're out of time, right? I mean, just really quickly, I would say that I put the link up here. It should be out in the Journal of Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology soon, but Robert Chapman, who's an autistic philosopher who also identifies as having mental health side lived experience, wrote a really great kind of critique about how kind of neo-Saucianism plays out in contemporary critical psychology and psychiatry, and he's presenting a critique of that, particularly in tension with kind of a critical disability studies approach. So it's a really rich paper. And then myself and Sandy Steingard wrote reflections, which just I think aren't out yet, but will be. I think will kind of bring the Saucian legacy, you know, kind of to bear on what's happening in terms of contemporary kind of politics around mental health and all, you know, kind of critical perspectives.